Advancing the cause of liberty takes more than just coming up with ideas. It means making them happen. This is Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome to episode 43 of Society and the State. Connor Boyack is here with me, and we have Adam Thierer on the telephone with us. And Adam, we're excited to talk with you. Adam's a senior fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. But Adam, you're also a guy who is very much on the cutting edge of technology. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your background and what kind of makes you tick.
Sure, I'd be pleased to. Well, I've spent the last 25 years covering the public policy implications of emerging technologies, starting back with the early days of the internet and the rise of broadband networks, and then continuing on through till today with the rise of various emerging technologies, including things like AI and robotics, driverless cars, commercial drones, Bitcoin, 3D printing, virtual reality, the sharing economy, advanced medical innovation, and much, much more. And in each of these areas, I've attempted to explore the various policy visions and conflicts that dominate the narratives about public policy issues surrounding each and every one of those technologies.
Adam, you did that exploration in your book called Permissionless Innovation, the continuing case for comprehensive technological freedom. I should point out for our listeners that we'll link to the book, to the website, and other resources that we may talk about on today's show notes page, which is societyandthestate.com/43. Now, this book was really interesting. I actually learned of it from a presentation that you gave about a year or so ago. Mercatus was kind enough to donate a few boxes of copies of your book that we sent to every legislator in our state to say, heads up, guys, here's a good blueprint that we need to follow. Let's maybe talk about the permissionless innovation with which many people are familiar, and that is just generally speaking the internet. How essential to the growth and proliferation of internet-based technologies, how essential has it been to have kind of the wild, wild west approach to public policy, and is that kind of your case for broadening that out to other technologies?
Yeah, that's generally right. Permissionless innovation generally stands for the proposition that new types of technology should be embraced and allowed, that they should be innocent until proven guilty by public policymakers, and that we should embrace the idea of not only risk-taking and entrepreneurialism, but even the possibility of a certain amount of failure while we are experimenting with new technologies. And we need to enshrine that into public policy in the form of essentially a legislative or regulatory green light to innovators to say it's okay to go out and experiment with new and different ways of doing things, even if it proves to be very disruptive to traditional business models or even other types of norms, be they just cultural or legal. Now, we in the United States embraced that ethos in the mid-1990s thanks to a bipartisan sort of agreement between the Clinton administration and a Republican Congress at the time to essentially not treat the internet and the digital economy as if it was just an appendage of the old broadcast or media world. And this was a really decisive moment because, of course, broadcasting and traditional media and communication systems were very, very heavily regulated. And as a result, we didn't see a lot of innovation in that space. It was a very stagnant area. We treated the internet very differently. We gave those innovators a green light and didn't require them to come get somebody's permission, either in Washington or at the state level, before they could launch a new project or idea. And I think the rest is history. We've got 20-plus years now of proof positive that that vision really paid wonderful dividends for our economy and for our nation's competitive advantage. And by contrast, if you look at the other side of the Atlantic and how Europe treated their internet innovators, it was with a very heavy hand and with a lot of red tape. And as a result, innovation there really suffered, so much so that I often like to begin lectures on these issues when I'm out at universities or at policy events by asking people, can you name any major European innovators in the internet or digital technology space? And people really struggle to figure out anybody. And sometimes they name something like Skype. Well, I say Skype's been owned by American companies for 20 years, even if it started in Europe. And all of the internet innovators, all of the VC money, it all came to America's shores because we had a more hospitable approach to innovation. And I think that's called permissionless innovation.
So I want to do a quick follow-up on that, Adam, because you mentioned being new technologies, emerging processes in tech that are disruptive to traditional business models. If you can speak to this, what was the opposition like? You mentioned that there was this kind of Clintonian congressional action that kind of shielded the internet or carved them out so they didn't have the same regulations. Was that did that face heavy opposition from the broadcast media and the incumbent players, or was it different for some reason?
Well, ironically enough, it sort of didn't, but because of almost an accident of history, which was the fact that at the time, and it's hard for many people to remember this far back, but 25 years ago, the internet was viewed by some people as a bit of a joke. We kind of looked at it and said, well, why would people use that? Or what are they going to do there? Or isn't it silly people would do these things on, by dialing up on their modems and connecting? And it was viewed as a novelty that wasn't going to really change the entire economy and culture as we know it. And of course, like all the great disruptive technologies, it took the world by storm and surprised us in a big way. But because at the time we didn't really view it as being that disruptive, the internet was famously barely even mentioned in the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which was the last major legislative attempt to regulate media and communication systems in the U.S. In fact, it was only mentioned 2 or 3 times. So it was, again, a fortuitous accident, if you will. But then there were other important policies that were also being put in place that did help the internet greatly, starting with the fact that the Clinton administration, to its eternal credit, basically decided to, in the early 90s, allow for the commercial development of the internet. Early on, when the internet was still mostly a government-based resource and the province of just a handful of government agencies and university academics, the Clinton administration said, that's not good enough. There's no reason it should be this non-commercial thing, or there are no commerce or advertising is allowed. We can open it up. And they did. And that was really step 1. Step 2 was that accident of history I described, which is, not regulating it like the old technologies. And then steps 3 and 4 were also important. Step 3 was that Congress, to the extent they talked about the internet at all, decided to immunize it from onerous types of liability for third-party contributions. So if you put a comment on Yelp or on eBay or Facebook, Yelp or eBay or Facebook can't be held liable for some stupid things you said or did on the internet. That's a very important policy that we did put in place. And then fourth and finally, there was in 1998 a bill passed called the Internet Tax Freedom Act, which shielded the internet from discriminatory state and local taxes that would be different or higher than traditional taxes. The combination of those 4 things really made sure that we enshrine the idea of permissionless innovation at the federal level into law. And again, as I said before, the rest is history.
Adam, you've made me appreciate the internet at a level that I never would have believed before. I thought it was a great thing before, but I have to ask you: has free innovation been the norm, or has that been the exception historically? Have we seen times where people were free to innovate, or has there always been kind of a precautionary policy or tendency to want to regulate emerging technologies?
That's a great question, and I think unfortunately the answer is all too often the impulse has been a very precautionary one, and one that has attempted to constrain or limit new innovations. Because let's face it, almost every innovation begins as a highly disruptive act, and sometimes it begins as a criminal act. It begins as a violation of law or policy of some sort, or at least cultural norms. And people don't much like the idea of new and different ways of doing things when they've settled into an old system that maybe protects them or their interests or whatever else. And, this is what really, I think, makes America unique and continues to make America one of the most innovative nations in the world, is that we have generally embraced a broader, more open vision for new disruptive innovation than other countries. And in doing so, we have also embraced the idea that it is okay to make mistakes and fail. In many countries and in many cultures, failure is looked upon with great shame. And that's a cultural thing as much as a legal one, but then it converts into law in the form of policies that protect old industries, old business models, or old professions. We don't generally do that in the U.S., and despite the fact that we are becoming a land of far too much regulatory accumulation and misguided tax policies, the reality is that it's all relative to other baselines internationally and historically. And so historically, there have been a lot of restraints, and internationally there continue to be. We're in a better position here. Not for every industry. I can name some notable exceptions to this, but generally speaking, America still does embrace more of a permissionless innovation vision for new technologies and entrepreneurship.
So, Adam, you did speak in generalities, and then note towards the end that there are exceptions, and one that I want to talk about is one that most people are familiar with, and that is Uber and Lyft, and and more broadly, even the sharing economy. But let's keep our example for a moment specific to these driving companies. And what I want to ask you is, you mentioned, you kind of teased this funny thing about, in some cases, the disruption is criminal. And if I understand my history right, Uber had a very intentional approach in their rollout where they would pay for any citations received by their drivers who were in violation of local ordinances, such that they could kind of develop a constituency, get a fan base, and then use that new audience in this new community who loved Uber to leverage, their strength and their collective organizing power to go into City Hall and change the law. Does that accurately explain the history of what happened? And is that approach potentially necessary in the disruption where you have these incumbent players who have a hold over lawmaking power?
Yeah, you've got it exactly right there. And in fact, some people have referred to this as evasive entrepreneurialism, and I sometimes even call it technological civil disobedience, which is that basically sometimes companies and new innovators look out at the landscape and say, geez, we haven't got a chance of changing the law or regulation. It's pretty stodgy, and we don't have the kind of money that the entrenched interests do, and we just don't want to spend the time and resources fighting in the legislative branch or the regulatory arena or even in the courts to change things. And so sometimes some firms will set out to very intentionally do an end run around the regulatory state. And in some ways, this is what both Uber and to some extent Airbnb did in the ride sharing and hospitality industries respectively. And, say what you want about it, it seems to have worked fairly effectively to really shake things up in a way that those sectors had not been shaken up in decades. In fact, I would argue we've got over a century's worth almost of local transportation and hospitality industry regulation and taxation that was almost never changed all that much. It was just tweaked at the margins, and consumer welfare really suffered, in my opinion, over the years because of the fact that we just could not get policies changed. And worse yet, those policies came to protect incumbent vested interests. Well, along came Uber and Lyft and Airbnb and other sharing economy innovators, and they said, the heck with this. And in basically very short order, I'd say really about 7 years, they completely upended the way those industries work. And most of us today, I think, if you ask the average guy or gal on the street, what do you think of Uber and Airbnb and the sharing economy? I think they're going to say generally positive things. They might push back a little bit about some corporate games and shenanigans that Uber's played, and that's probably right to push back on. But the reality is we're better off for the sort of innovations that they pursued and the fact that they gave us, for the first time in many, many decades, serious choice, more price competition, and higher quality service. That is a huge win for consumers, but it only happened, we should state again, by those companies in engaging a little bit of that evasive entrepreneurship and being willing to shake things up at great risk to themselves and their investors.
Okay, I'm going to ask you about another specific kind of emerging technology that looks like it could really shake things up. And Adam, I want to get your comments actually on cryptocurrency, blockchain technology. The money power in America has done things a certain way for a very long time, and it lends a great deal of power and control to not only those who create the money, who bank in the money, but government regulators as well. What are your thoughts on the emerging, cryptocurrencies?
Yeah, well, that's one of the most exciting spaces that is set to be potentially disrupted by new innovation is the financial services and the sort of monetary world. Is that, it's very heavily regulated, and some of those regulations are, worthwhile. But the reality is that it generally speaking has always tended to be one of the most over-regulated sectors. And clearly, one of the things that government uses to exert control over a population more than anything else almost is money and the control of money. And so clearly Bitcoin has that advantage in that it offers some potential ways to put some pressure on that point of control. But more generally, blockchain technology offers a whole host of other types of applications and innovations that could shake up many different sectors. So the hope would be that by allowing a space for a certain amount of entrepreneurship to happen in that area with blockchain-based technologies, that we start to see the same disruptive things take place in many different fields owing to that innovation.
Adam, what's your appeal to legislators? Because at the end of the day, you're asking elected officials to take the approach that you're articulating? You're asking them to take a hands-off approach. Is it that you point to precedent and say, look how great this was for the internet, therefore, with these other new exciting industries, we can have the same if only you will take a hands-off approach? At the end of the day, are you asking them to have faith, right, to kind of step a foot out into the dark and say, yes, there will be problems and challenges, and some people might get hurt or even die, but the net positive for society is a much better thing? How do you articulate your appeal to elected officials to adopt a permissionless innovation approach?
Yeah, great question. Well, I begin by making it clear what generations of economists and political scientists and economic historians have concluded in a consensus fashion, which is that technological innovation is the single most important determinant of long-term economic growth and improvement in human living standards. And that once you understand and accept that fact, that reality, then you start to realize how important it is to reorient your nation or your state's or your locality's innovation policy around the idea of something like permissionless innovation, at least giving more of a green light, not a perfectly free green light. We're not talking about anarchy here, but we're talking about giving the benefit of the doubt to innovators. Again, innovation should be innocent until proven guilty. And how do you do that? Well, you begin with a great deal of humility as a policymaker about saying we don't always know the answer. We don't have a techno crystal ball. We can't stare into the future and know the answers. We have to be willing to, as you said, sort of take that uncertain first step and embrace the future together and give a wide berth to the idea of allowing innovators to go out and experiment. And then as far as public policies go, it begins with two things. Number one, where public policies don't exist for new innovations or technologies or sectors. So let's call these sectors sort of technologies or sectors that are quote unquote born free. Technologies that are born free, like say 3D printing or virtual reality, these are technologies that have no regulatory regime or no agencies. And we should try to keep them that way. So for born free technologies, we need a policy that resembles what the Clinton administration did for the internet, where we basically say, hey, look, let's be hands-off. Let's give this a chance. Make it market-driven. Let's protect what good it's got going right now. But the problem is we have a whole host of industries and technologies that are alternatively what I'll call born into captivity or stuck in captivity. And these are things like cars and planes and banking and other sectors. And the new technology and innovation comes along, tries to disrupt those, but they butt up against the old rules. In those sectors, we need policymakers to get a little bit more specific about how to remove barriers to innovation, how to remove red tape and old licensing and permitting schemes, and trying to make sure in particular, that they don't pigeonhole new technologies into old regulatory boxes. That's the biggest mistake of all. They try to level the proverbial playing field by saying, well, look, we've always regulated hotels or taxis this way, so you, Uber and Airbnb, you have to be regulated this way too. No. That's never the right answer. Two wrongs don't make a right. You don't want to double down on yesterday's failed business regulatory model for new businesses and innovators. You instead want to say, look, embrace the new innovation model and make that the model for all the old sectors and give them more freedom, not more restraints. So that is probably going to be the hardest thing for policymakers to do, because it will require them to say, look, we messed up in the past, or these old policies did not have the pro-consumer benefits that we had hoped for. We need a fresh start. And, of course, the biggest problem there is that a lot of incumbents will even go to bat for old regulatory regimes or tax systems because they've learned how to benefit from them, even if they spent so many decades bitching about them. So that's the real irony here, is that things like Uber and Airbnb and all the other new disruptive technologies, sometimes their biggest fight is not with the regulators or policymakers who sometimes do want to change policy. It's with the old guard. It's with the old industry players who are trying to protect their turf.
Well, Adam, the proof in the pudding seems to be, do these emerging technologies improve our lives? And, you look at things like the internet, look at Lyft and Uber and Airbnb, and I think the answer most people are going to come up with is yes. So thank you for fighting the fight that you are carrying forward.
Well, thank you so much for having me today.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.